So I'm going to start with the topic that I had planned on speaking with you about today. And that was about Russia and Ukraine and the change in the Trump administration to move from essentially preventing Ukraine from rearming in order to try to increase pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainians to negotiate with Vladimir Putin and the Russians. And the recent decision, really it's an about face on the part of the Trump administration to begin cooperating with the European project of rearming Ukraine, allowing Ukraine to defend itself, allowing Ukraine to continue to inflict damages on the Russians, on the conviction, on the one hand, that Russia is the aggressor in this war and that Ukraine deserves to be able to defend itself, and on the other hand, that as the aggressor, it's Russia that needs to feel the pressure to be able to have some sort of ceasefire and then negotiated resolution to this conflict. Yes, Ukraine at this point is holding out for maximalist position in the negotiations. It wants all of its territory, including Crimea, back, but Russia really is the primary impediment to some sort of negotiated solution, and therefore Ukraine should be armed in order to make this even more costly for Russia. And I am, on the one hand, certainly sympathetic to the idea that Ukraine deserves to be able to defend itself from naked aggression from a neighbor. And on the other hand, I'm also between a rock and a hard place. I have to acknowledge that I don't know whether Russia can be pressured into negotiating peace. And here I'll start with the idea that it still is a crime in 2025 as we enter the fourth year of this war. We're now, a third of the way into the fourth year of this war, for anybody in Russia to call this a war, right? And the staggering casualty figures, right? It appears that we're approaching at least 1.5 million casualties in this war, and that the casualties are 2 to 1 Russian to Ukrainian. We should feel, I think, genuine sympathy for the Russian people who are having their sons fed to the meat grinder by their president, who feels no compunction about using Russian soldiers to eventually degrade Ukraine's supply of basic munitions, just throwing them wave after wave after wave, so that Ukraine eventually runs out of the shells, the drones, the supplies that it needs to fight for the territorial integrity of its own country. And by the way, the Russian economy has contracted substantially over the course of this war due to international sanctions, due to the cost of this war. Inflation is rampant in Russia today, and what would be required to fight inflation would also undermine the war effort. And so the Russian people are suffering. And I think, frankly, the real hope for peace in Ukraine would be that Putin feels enough internal pressure, whether that is from fellow oligarchs, the Russian elite, to the extent that they have any independence and any capacity to bring any pressure to bear on him, or from the Russian people who grow tired eventually of the terribly destructive leadership of their autocratic dictator. And here I'll just say, I have no way of estimating when the second scenario is going to occur, or if the first scenario is at all likely. And that is because the Russian public sphere, the Russian media system, the key institutions of Russian civil society that are responsible for collecting and organizing and transmitting knowledge and information and informing public discourse have all been so dismantled that it is no longer possible, as far as I can tell, for the Russian public to really form an opinion independently, to really know the truth, to really be able to coalesce or come together or organize themselves around the idea that the barbarism of this war has gone on for too long and it needs to end, right? That they are told on a regular basis it's not a war, that it's there because, well, the first Jewish president of the Ukraine is somehow also a Nazi because Ukrainians were repressing and persecuting the Russian language and national minority within the Ukraine because Russia is the wedge edge of NATO that is posing a threat to Russia. All of this manifestly false and disinformation, but nevertheless, if you turn on Russian television, Russian radio, Russian news, read the newspaper, or for the most part, go onto social media, with the exception of some secure messaging services within Russia, this is basically what you hear. And so one of the questions that we're going to address today is how fragile the truth is, how fragile establishing a common factual basis of knowledge is for a community and especially a democracy in the modern era. And so I obviously have on the board Jeffrey Epstein, and I have him palling around with Donald Trump 25 years ago, and I have him in jail 5 years ago. And as we were discussing before we actually started, right, the focus on Epstein, I think, is really bedeviling Donald Trump and the Trump administration at this point. And they it's astounding, I think, in a sense, to see, right, that an administration that has maintained it would not cut Medicaid, that has succeeded politically in gaining control of all three branches of the federal government by bringing in the less well off portions of the American electorate, the less wealthy, the less well educated, has nevertheless taken $1 trillion away from their health insurance and food assistance from the programs that they rely on, and they don't seem to be paying a political price for that, right? But when they don't produce the Epstein files, it appears that the manosphere, the social media ecosystem that Trump has relied on is turning against him over this issue and not the substantive issues of policy. And in trying to explain this and discuss this with you today, I just want to notice very quickly, right, that Donald Trump assembled a coalition and the MAGA Republican Party assembled a coalition. That's what parties and leaders do in modern competitive electoral democracies. And the coalition that Donald Trump assembled was savvy in his appreciation for the fragmentation of the American media system and with it the American public sphere and ultimately the American public. That there were a significant portion of people who believed with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that there was a conspiracy to cover up the health liabilities associated with vaccines, including, for instance, autism. right? And then he also brought into his campaign, going back to 2016, but especially in 2020 when he became president in 2017, very quickly the online conspiracy theory called QAnon took off. And he campaigned in 2020 in a way that signaled covertly or subtly that he had some sympathy and some agreement with that online conspiracy theory, which tended to view him as a savior against the evil cabal that controlled the deep state and the federal government, and that engaged in horrific predatory stuff, including, I'm sorry, drinking the blood of children, right? And that although he didn't win in 2020, he had clearly tapped this element of the conspiratorial disinformation media ecosystem, and he continued to rely on it, to amplify it going into the 2024 election. And by the way, a fair bit of what happened in those years also cooperated, maybe even in certain sectors of the twisted information system, corroborated what Donald Trump was saying. The right coronavirus, was it produced in a Chinese lab? Was it spread by China as part of an effort to bring down the United States? Did public health research officials cover that up? Did they then use the coronavirus as a way of extending their control over society into local schools, into local healthcare systems, into local workplaces? And then, by the way, going back to 2019, Jeffrey Epstein, right, getting apprehended for a second time as a sexual predator, being apparently very close to being prosecuted, potentially, and this gets now into the conspiracy theory disinformation world, being able to tell some of the truth about the deep state and all of the terrible stuff it did, right? And then mysteriously dying in jail, despite the fact that we were told the right prison psychologist said this man is a suicide risk. He's already tried to kill himself once. Don't leave him alone. And then he's basically left in circumstances where he's able to kill himself. And right then, by the way, Joe Biden's rapid mental decline and the effort on the part of his staff to insulate him from public scrutiny, to prevent the public from seeing him in his incapacitated moments or maybe incapacitated state. The then right fact that he handed off his right nomination to his vice president without any sort of alternative nomination process. The fact that there were multiple assassination attempts on Donald Trump. All of this feeds this conspiratorial mindset, and Donald Trump is very gifted at, in his rally, but also in his media appearances, in his posts on media systems, bringing those people into the fold, making them think that he actually is in on the secret and supports their beliefs. And then we look at his administration, right? And obviously Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Pash Patel, right, are people who have fed this media ecosystem. He brings in Pete Hegseth, who is a talking head in the media, Pam Bondi and Dan. Sorry, I'm losing track of the rogues gallery of character here, right? Bogino. These are all people who, in different ways, have participated in and fed this alternative media ecosystem that is producing all of this conspiracy theory and disinformation, and they end up in prominent places in the Trump administration, in charge very often of the very institutions that their conspiracy theories had targeted in the past. And um, they continue to feed the conspiracy theories, right? In February, we have Pam Bondi saying that she has the Epstein files and she's preparing to divulge their secrets. We have Pash Patel saying similar things, right, to Joe Rogan, etc. And so the idea that Donald Trump is having a hard time now turning off the spigot and saying to his supporters, wait, this was all fabricated. This is not real. And by the way, I cannot provide you what you're looking for. The list of very important people, especially Democrats who were operative in the governments of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and continue to constitute the deep state and who were engaged in this terrible predatory behavior. Here's the list that proves it. And this is the beginning of the purge, right? This is the beginning of the effort to finally dislodge these terrible people from the positions of power they occupy in our society. And once I do that, speaking in the voice of Donald Trump here, we can then begin to make these institutions work for you instead of working for the corrupt elite who are currently their chief beneficiaries and are pulling the strings behind the scenes to do all kinds of awful stuff to innocent children, but also to you, the ordinary Americans. And it's that confidence, it's that faith that Donald Trump is actually going to start to make government work for you. And it is the work that a conspiracy theory does, which is to say, actually, this is not going to be hard to do. This is not going to involve detailed, difficult policy fights that will slowly but surely begin to maybe restore a middle class society to the United States of America. That stuff is, as people like to say, the slow boring of hardwood, right? It's really hard. It takes a long time. And by the way, the narrative that you have to accept in order to think, well, the problem here is in part globalization. The problem here is in part automation. The problem here is in part the transition to a post-industrial economy and the way in which that's much harder to organize unions in. The problem is artificial intelligence and computational technology and what that's doing to our jobs. And by the way, the problem here is perhaps also overregulation and the way in which that's making housing and other goods too expensive. The problem is the patchwork healthcare and insurance system that we have in the United States and what that does to medical expenses. That stuff, right, is not quite as entertaining, as riveting, or maybe even as accessible and convincing as there's an evil cabal that is doing this to you, and all we have to do is take them down. And in previous discussions, we focused on immigrants and China as doing this right, that the enemies that the Trump administration is targeting in order to be able to take control of our country back. But please note, it's also Jeffrey Epstein, right? And the fact that he's incredibly wealthy, the fact that he hobnobs with some of the most wealthy and influential people of his time, the fact that he's a convicted pedophile, the fact that he was, right, charged again and it appeared really going to face the music, the fact that he got off on the sweetest plea deal in the history of the United States, or maybe for the last 50 years, whatever it is, fact that he's Jewish, right? All of this contributes to this idea that there's a credible conspiracy that Donald Trump is going to be the shining knight to take down, and then everything will start to work in American society the way it used to, right? And so the idea that these people who fed this conspiracy can't just turn it off, right? That it is too deeply woven into the narrative that accounts for the political success of Donald Trump, the MAGA Republicans, the team he has assembled, is why the Epstein story appears to have such life, appears to be so dangerous to the Trump coalition in ways that bombing Iran, or that, right, attacking the fabric of American communities by deporting people who have no criminal record and are important, productive people in the economy and pillars of their community from the country hasn't done, right? And by the way, that the big beautiful bill didn't do, this appears to be maybe something that is a little harder for Donald Trump's Teflon to deflect. And I think that's for reasons related to the very promise of Donald Trump as a politician. And I do think it deserves our attention, despite the fact that I think most of it is founded on unverifiable, likely exaggerated conspiracy theories. But that's not all I want to talk with you about today, because as you can see, and I feel like I owe Stephen Colbert an apology for putting him in the rogues gallery with all these other awful people, but I have Stephen Colbert, PBS, and NPR on the board as well, and that is because, right, Stephen Colbert, as we learned, was told in the middle of this week that he will not be renewed once his contract expires. So he got roughly another uh, year of Colbert at the helm of the Late Show, but after that he'll be gone, and the whole show will be gone. And I'll just point out, I think there's a plausible version of the firing of Colbert that is purely financial, right? And it does have to do with something I want to speak with you about, which is the restructuring of our media system. And the fact of the matter is that fewer people are watching late night television because they're spending their time on their devices instead, right? They're looking at YouTube or TikTok, or they're streaming something they want to watch on Netflix or Amazon Prime. And by the way, the targeted advertising that those platforms enable is much more effective than the broadcast advertising that accompanies Colbert, and so that revenue is drying up. But having said that, I think we also, of course, have to note that CBS, its parent company Paramount, are in merger talks with another company that will potentially earn the owners of the parent company billions of dollars, and that that merger needs to be approved by the FCC maybe the SEC, maybe the Department of Justice, and we know that the Trump administration is not at all reluctant to use its control of those regulatory institutions to reward its friends and punish its enemies. And we know, right, that Donald Trump sued CBS and 60 Minutes, one of its flagship news shows, and he did so on the basis of totally exaggerated claims, right? That the interview that 60 Minutes did with Kamala Harris was edited to be favorable to her. If that were true, it would still not be libel defamation, anything that wouldn't be allowed for, right, a journalistic organization to do. But the truth of the matter is, yes, they edited and chopped up the interview, but they broadcast most of the rest of it in other news segments. They weren't trying to make Harris look better than what she was in that interview. They were just trying to get maximal mileage out of the footage that they got in that interview. Had this gone to court, there is no doubt that Donald Trump would have lost, but CBS settled in part because they want their merger to be approved. This feeds Donald Trump's media ecosystem and saying, see, the mainstream media are biased against you. But, right, to Stephen Colbert's credit, on Monday he called it out. He said this is essentially a bribe that CBS and Paramount have paid to Donald Trump in order to get their merger approved. And 3 days later, he's gone. Right. And I'm not going to engage in counter conspiracy theory and say I know for sure that Colbert was fired, but frankly, the mere fact, right, fired because of what he said on Monday or because he's an outspoken critic of Donald Trump, who, by the way, uses humor in a highly effective way, in a way that perhaps serious discourse doesn't work as well. But having said that, the mere fact that it seems plausible that part of the reason that Colbert was fired was because of his criticism of Trump and his criticism of his employer for corruptly enriching Trump in order to get their merger approved is an indication, a symptom of the fact that the Trump administration is going to war against mainstream media, using its power to intimidate the organizations of civil society into reporting favorably on the Trump administration or in order to chill criticism of the administration. I think there is no doubt that what happened with Colbert will chill other organizations. And then the final piece in my overall organizing, right, template here is noticing that NPR and PBS just had their funding rescinded, right? And that's a technical process in which Congress takes back funding that it has already appropriated. And please note, right, that it did it at the president's request and in ways that will be damaging to the constituents of the people who voted for it. This probably rings familiar. But please note also, right, that the amount of money that's going to be saved here is not even a rounding error in the amount of money that the big, beautiful bill is going to cost the country over the next decade. And please note, to his credit, Donald Trump didn't say, I want the money back because we need it to balance the budget. He said, I don't like NPR. I don't like PBS. I think that they are too liberal. I think they're fragmenting the public. And I just want to notice for a moment, right? PBS, NPR are traditional news organizations. They are, in fact, what are sometimes called legacy media organizations, which tends to be the way of saying leading or among the best, the most credible, the best resourced, the institutions that employ the journalists who hold themselves to the highest standard of truth and relevance and credibility and verifiability. And so in saying, right, I don't like the ideology of PBS and NPR, I think what Donald Trump is really saying is I don't like the mainstream media. And there's one portion of the mainstream legacy media that the government funds that we can defund. And by the way, of course, we know that Donald Trump doesn't like the mainstream media. He is repeatedly suing them. He calls them the enemies of the people. He calls them, right, the lying media, the fake news. And this is, I think, not just an attack on the media system. This is part of an overall attack on civil society institutions. So institutions that are not part of the government, but that are nevertheless part of a society that is organized as a democracy that does its best to educate its citizens, or our citizens, we the people, do the best to educate and inform ourselves, to make sure that we have relevant political information before we vote, that we listen to each other, that we're engaged in informed dialogue, right? And that when you attack the universities, when you attack the Associated Press, PBS, NPR, when you attack law firms that are engaged in political litigation, you are assaulting the institutions that allow for the construction of a shared sense of reality that is, in fact, grounded in our best efforts to gather knowledge, to verify what we believe, to filter it for credibility and relevance. That's what PBS does. That's what NPR does. In certain respects, that's what Stephen Colbert does. That's what the Associated Press does. That's what the universities do. And all of this is under assault. And please remember where I started. I started, of course, with Vladimir Putin and what it looks like to live in a society in which all of this has been undermined. And now the leader, the autocrat, can simply control the narrative. So, with that explanation in mind, let me go a little bit into some of the details of what I have to share with you today. And I was looking around for I'm not finding my phone, which has accurate time. Hopefully, my watch is relatively accurate. I'm going to start with some older information, and I haven't seen anybody accumulate anything like this more recently. So this is from a book by Robert McChesney, one of the leading media scholars in the United States. It's about a decade old now, right? So in certain respects, this just doesn't take into account some of the transformations that have occurred as the social media, digital, networked public sphere has taken hold. But I still think it's relevant and important. And what McChesney did was he ranked countries by funding for public media. And if there's any silver lining to PBS and NPR losing their federal funding, it's that there wasn't a lot of that funding to begin with. And you can see this by comparing Norway, which spends $130 per person per year, with the United States, which spends $1.40 per person per year. Literally, right? Norway is spending $129 more, or almost 100 times as much as the United States on its public media system. And then you can see, I like looking at the United Kingdom because I think we're all familiar with the BBC, right? The United Kingdom is not as extreme as Norway, they're spending about $90 per person per year to have one of the flagship public media systems in the world. What McChesney then did was to correlate it with two other variables. One was different ways of measuring the freedom of the press, right? One is from Reporters Without Borders, the other is from Freedom House. And what I hope you can see, right, Norway, Denmark, Finland, UK, those are the countries with the highest expenditures. And by the way, they're also among the top countries in terms of freedom of the press. And then the final correlation that he looked at was the Economist Democracy Index. And so this takes into account, well, how free and fair and open are your elections? How much does the process of debating the issues actually play out in the election, as opposed to, say, the personality of the candidate or the funding of the party? How much does the public know about the legislation that's being debated before it is actually voted on? And as you can see, right, the countries that spend the most on public media not only have the best scores in terms of freedom of the press, they also do very well on the democracy index. And please note, right, the United States is quite low in terms of freedom of the press and quite low in terms of the democracy index. And so the idea, and I just want to share McChesney's analysis with you for a moment, is that in a society with a strong, well-funded public media system, the public media set the tone for the entire media system. If you go to London, I was recently in London, you turn the television on right in your hotel. First channel is BBC One, second channel BBC Two, third channel BBC Three. It's not till you get to the fourth channel that you get to ITV or a commercial broadcast station, right? And the commercial broadcast stations compete with the public media system. The commercial radio competes with the public radio in Britain, in Norway, in Denmark, in Finland, in all of these countries that spend 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 times more than the United States spends. Frankly, PBS, NPR have never been leading media organizations in the United States, in the sense that they direct attention, that everybody pays attention to what they report on and compares themselves with these outlets in the way that they do in the societies that spend more. And I think that means, frankly, that we have failed to adequately fund not just our public media, but to adequately shepherd our overall media system so that it would be conducive to the health of our democracy. And I want to say a little bit more about why I think that. The difference between a public media system and a commercial media system is in the values that dictate the production of the content that they broadcast. And of course, not everything that is broadcast, not the majority that is broadcast, is news, right? But I'm going to focus on news because it seems to be most important to our capacity to establish a shared and reliable sense of reality, a factual basis for our politics. When commercial media decide what to broadcast, they need to take into account their ability to generate revenue, right? That's their whole business model. And so they need to take into account what's going to get advertisers and keep people focused on this channel so that the advertisers pay good money to advertise on our show. And so one thing we know is you tend not to get a lot of coverage of the stuff that is critical of the companies that advertise on your network. You also tend to get more human interest or more scandal mongering or more salacious news because that draws the eyes and that increases the ad revenue for the station. Whereas public media systems, because they are not dependent on purchasing, selling advertising and getting their revenues and making profit to give to their shareholders or their owners, have fundamentally distinct production values guiding what they produce. They tend to think first and foremost of what is publicly relevant and valuable, what is credible and reliable, what is salutary in the sense that it is going to contribute to healthy public dialogue. And when you have your public media system as one of the leading media systems in your society, it changes the tone in the private media system because people flip the channel and say, wait a sec, this stuff looks like garbage relative to that stuff. And so if you're going to, if you will, minimize the amount of disinformation, the proportion of media content that is distracting and destructive in your media system, having a strong public media system is one of the best ways to do it. And please note, these countries all have private media as well, right? And you want that for the sake of freedom of the press and to have a vital public sphere, but not to be dominated by commercial media. Now, I'm going to do two things at once, and I have a fair bit of information I want to share with you. We're probably not going to cover it all today, but I do want to start. So what is the actual damage going to be of further defunding the public media system? So remember, we're already anemic in our funding. We already underfund our media system. What will happen? Well, in the top map of the United States, you have all of the places that have NPR radio stations that are economically vulnerable. And I just want you to look at it for a second and to see that these places where the public funding for the NPR station, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of also the PBS, right, TV stations, is paying most of the bills, right? It's not getting a lot of contributions, are the less populated, the rural areas, the small cities, small towns. And by the way, please remember that roughly 50% of the newspapers in the United States have closed in the last 30 years, that nearly 2/3 of the journalists in the United States have lost their jobs in the same time period. And so it's not like there's good alternative local media, that in many ways, right, this is the information infrastructure or the lifeblood, the knowledge system of these communities. And so this is going to further accelerate the transition away from people getting their information from regular, mainstream, traditionally organized media systems and push more and more of them into social media for their information. Now, I've got this other diagram on the board, and this is from my own research. This is actually a diagram I've generated, and it's meant to represent a mediatized public sphere. And so to just start with that term for a moment, right? We are not in an ancient Athenian city-state where all of the citizens can come together to discuss the issues facing us in person before we vote. We rely on media to integrate our society and to carry the conversations that we are trying to have as the citizens of a complex society. And by the way, it's not like that's the only thing that's going on. And so on this diagram, I have corporations hiring lobbyists in order to influence what the legislature does to make laws that are favorable. I have wealthy individuals hiring lobbyists, interest groups lobbying the government, right? Dark monies being contributed to political parties. There are a lot of different channels of influence permeating our highly complex public sphere. But I've highlighted the idea that we increasingly have social media-based partition subpublics. And so starting with QAnon and moving into Jeffrey Epstein and moving further out into the manosphere and the other quadrants of the MAGA social media system, right? This is not, I assume, what most of us are spending a lot of our time on, right? And so these are partition subpublics. I think I need to bring in now just a little bit more about the infrastructure, the technological organization of social media systems, right? And so social media systems do not have the structure of traditional media in the United States in the 20th century. They do not have editors who are professional journalists who are assigning stories and then editing the stories and then making editorial decisions about whether to publish and if so, where to publish the story based on reliability, credibility, relevance, contribution to public knowledge, right? And then journalists who are also trained in public ethics, in journalistic ethics, who are, right, therefore, right, doing their jobs in responsible ways. They don't have fact checkers, right? All of the infrastructure that is designed to create reliable, useful, relevant information and knowledge in the overall media system is not there in the social media-based media system. As opposed to that, any individual who wants to can post anything they want to on social media, and people do billions of times a day. But most of it doesn't circulate very widely. What determines what circulates widely is what's called an algorithm, which is, right, a complex computational process powered by artificial intelligence that is basically monitoring how engaging is this content, which is one way of saying how much does it draw and hold the attention of a segment of our potential users? Does it have the capacity to go viral and really pull people into an engaged level of attention with the social media system? And by the way, right, that's what determines what you see. If you like ballet, you're going to see a lot of ballet. If you spend more time looking at ballet, liking ballet, following the links about ballet. If you like football, same thing. If you like political conspiracy theory, same thing. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether what you're looking at is true or relevant or totally misleading or fabricated. What matters from the perspective of the algorithm primarily is that it draws your attention and is going to draw the attention of people like you. And so it's going to be put out to a lot of people if it does. And there are some minimal processes of trying to prevent certain highly destructive kinds of disinformation or information from circulating, but they're woefully inadequate to weeding out the tremendous proportion of disinformation on the social media system of media within our overall media ecosystem. And so this area that I have circled and highlighted has become increasingly central to our overall media system and the overall public sphere of a society with a digital media system. Now, I think this will probably have to be all I'm going to do for today. We can come back and do more of this. I want to notice, right? What are the institutions that are fighting the influence of social media disinformation? Its rapid transmission and the increasing salience of it to our attention as a society. Well, colleges and universities, right? Really important. Law firms that go after uh, the organizations that are circulating highly destructive information, the research infrastructure within the federal government. And please note, right, the big, beautiful bill is going to make higher education much more expensive. The Trump administration is in the process of dismantling the Department of Education, right? The Trump administration, in targeting universities, has taken away billions of dollars of research funds. The EPA has just announced that it will eliminate its research wing. The Kennedy administration removed the entire panel from the Center of Disease Control of vaccine experts, replaced them, and then based on completely discredited uh, previous studies, right? The scientific consensus is that the ingredient that Kennedy and company don't like in certain vaccines, fortunately not ones that we in this country rely very much on, are associated with certain health risks. Not credible information, but it is now being acted upon by the CDC advisory board, which is likely to have national effects in terms of not only what insurance will cover, but also just stirring the pot of vaccine disinformation, making it look more and more credible because the quacks who believe this stuff are now being amplified by the apparently quite official uh, organizations of our government, right? And so the idea that our current presidential administration is a creature of the new media technology that has come online over the last 20 years and is dismantling the alternative sources of more reliable information, of research, relying instead on these alternative non-expert sources to set critical policy agendas, I think is deeply indicative of, to go back to where I started, of a kind of war on reliable information, on an effort to amplify conspiracy theory to the extent that it is supportive of the political agenda of the president and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And by the way, has been highly successful, right? Donald Trump has been elected president twice. MAGA has essentially taken over the entirety of the Republican Party and is very quickly restructuring our federal government. But for precisely that reason, the Epstein story is going to be very hard for it to control. I'm coming out of my slides both to give you time and space to discuss this, but also because I need to see what time it is. I think my sense of timing was pretty good. I have a lot more information. I would like to continue the discussion with you, but that may have to wait till next week because I want you also to have the opportunity to weigh in. Flossie, unmute yourself so that you can weigh in. You're still muted. You got to hit the space bar or hold down the microphone icon. So, anybody close to Flossie to help? I know sometimes people are. Flossie, are you seeing the space bar or the icon I'm talking about? Looks like a little microphone. Probably has outlined in red with a line through it right now, which means you're muted. I doubt this helps. I'm going to do the ask to unmute command on my end. I'll tell you what.
Good.
Let me unmute everyone. And let's try to stay silent in the back.
We got it.
Flossie
Okay,
has it.
good. Fantastic. Go ahead, Flossie.
Okay. You can't hear me, and
I can hear
We
you.
can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. The thing that affects me the most is that Epstein supposedly hanged himself in prison. Nobody hangs himself in prison.
Yes, I do.
He was hanged by special orders. Otherwise, he would not have the strength even to wash his face. Once they closed the bars on him, he was over. Now, the woman who was involved with him may be still serving time. That makes me suspect that in addition to political shenanigans, Trump might have been involved in some kind of pornography, some kind of business that would bring money to him. In other words, nothing is sacred. That's so scary. He will go any place. I mean, Epstein was a wimp. How much could he know? But he could also do errands for the president, and so the president did some errands for him. He got rid of him. It is so dirty. George Clooney may be in danger.
Oh, no.
So,
Everything is possible.
so,
Okay.
so
Okay.
Flossie, I just am going to observe that what you're saying is, of course, speculative, right? We don't know why Epstein died, or we don't have sufficient information. I'm also going to point out, and I'll say a couple of things here. One of them is this is a position we're in all the time, right? Which is to say so much of what we believe we don't directly verify ourselves. I say that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is relying on debunked research to call into question the safety of vaccines. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, I'll admit I have not read both the original study and the debunking study, in part because I'm not an immunologist or a virologist. I don't have the relevant information, the knowledge, the expertise to be able to meaningfully form an independent opinion about this. But I do listen to medical doctors. I do listen to research scientists. I do listen to good journalists who have interviewed those people and who have a background that allows them to acquire a certain level of expertise. And so we all rely on reported information, and on, right, a division of labor within our society that allows some people to become expert in some topics and then hopefully to transmit that information to the rest of us. And I agree with you that the death of Jeffrey Epstein in jail seems suspect, but I'm not sure it seems more suspect than the deaths of hundreds of people in jails in the United States each year. And frankly, I'm not sure. I mean, that there are rumors, right, that Jeffrey Epstein got a very light plea bargain sentence the first time that he was brought up on charges in Florida related to his, paying young girls to give him massages and then apparently, I'm sorry, masturbating in their presence, because who knows, right? One version of the story is that it came down to the prosecutors that he was an intelligence asset and they were supposed to go light on him. Another version, which seems to me to be equally plausible, is that he was a rich, well-connected man and that he knew who to ask to call to get the favor done so that he wouldn't have to serve a lot of time in jail. And so that's the kind of society we live in. That seems to me there's this old philosophical principle, Occam's razor. Choose the simplest explanation when you don't have a lot of information to give you the clear cut preferred explanation. That seems to me to be the simplest explanation. But having said all that, I also want to note, it's a little peculiar that we're spending all this time talking about Jeffrey Epstein and so little time talking about the big beautiful bill and what it's going to do to people's health insurance, right? A lot of people are going to die because
Yeah.
of the legislation that was just passed. And by the way, a lot of children are going to go hungry. And by the way, there's going to be a lot of damage to our economy and maybe ultimately to the solvency of our government. And by the way, the tariffs are isolating the United States in a way that's going to be extremely detrimental to our long-term leadership in the world. And by the way, right, the big beautiful bill also basically vacated all federal funding for research on battery technology. And the research I was doing until I shifted gears and started talking about this was about warfare in the Ukraine. And the Ukrainian military is using drones that cost them $1,000 to destroy Russian military equipment that costs tens of millions of dollars. It's a new kind of asymmetrical warfare, and it seems to be totally dependent on who has the best battery technology, and we're cutting off the funding for that. So I want to say I don't know whether Jeffrey Epstein was killed or killed himself. I want to say I don't know who maybe at some point had sex with the terrible, right, trafficking of young girls that Jeffrey Epstein was engaged in, or what else corrupt he did. And I'm not sure that's the best expenditure of my energy right now to try to figure that stuff out as opposed to concentrating on this other stuff. But then I also want to add, by the way, why do conspiracy theories take hold, right? Because they offer powerful explanations that help us to make sense of stuff we're struggling to make sense of. And by the way, they seem very often to promise relief from stuff that is making our lives much worse, right? And Donald Trump is making our lives much worse, right? He's doing moral injury to us on a daily basis. We have to watch our fellow citizens or the people who are not citizens, but who are doing essential services in our economy, cower in their homes for fear of ICE or deportation. And we're watching families and communities be torn apart. I would love to think that Donald Trump is a pedophile and is going to be exposed as such, but frankly, I have no evidence that that's true. And I think it's enough to say about Donald Trump that he's a terrible president and he's doing really destructive things to our society, including to our capacity to converge on a shared sense of reality that is actually informed by research and knowledge. And so that's where I really wanted to concentrate today.
Then
Um,
congratulations. You have no fear. I have no fear because you're a troublemaker, and so am I. Okay?
by the way, it's the fifth anniversary of John Lewis's death. You remember what he said? Make good trouble. Yeah,
Oh,
let's
we're
keep.
yelling it. That's what I kept yelling. Make good trouble.
Yes, let's keep doing it together, Flossie. Thank you. Hannah, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, my only comment is that the whole Epstein thing is indeed just a big blah blah to cover exactly what's going on, and that we're all falling for it. It's being successful. Once more, he understands propaganda devices and is using it very well.
Well, so Hannah, I'm going to slightly disagree with you as well. I'm not sure it's working to his advantage in 2025. I completely agree with you. For the last decade, peddling this kind of conspiracy theory junk has worked to his advantage because he has campaigned again and again and again against the system. The system is corrupt, and the reason you, the people who are thinking about voting for me, are suffering, the reason you can't afford to buy a house or afford your medical care, or the reason your job is much less satisfactory than it used to be, or maybe has gone away entirely, is because of that corrupt system. But guess what? Donald Trump is now in his midway through his fifth year as president, right? And Donald Trump this time seems to be very effective at pushing aside all of the impediments to him exercising his will, right? Is Donald Trump still an anti-system candidate, or is Donald Trump just the system, right? And if what Jeffrey Epstein is symptomatic of, or what he symbolizes, is mistrust of the system, right? If Donald Trump starts to look like somebody who's defending the system, part of the system, is the system, and therefore can't deliver the dirt on Epstein, please note, right, the refrain I see on social media from liberals, from progressives, from radicals now is Trump is on the list, right? I don't know if you've seen the meme of him with the MAGA hat, which just says I'm on the list, right, as opposed to Make America Great Again. This is one of those poetic situations where the monster you've made comes back to eat you, right? And I just think that maybe at this point Trump is not quite as in control of this as he has been of late, and it may not be quite as advantageous for him, which doesn't mean I want to say Trump is on the list. because I don't know that there's a list. I'm actually a little skeptical that there is a list. What I do want to say, again, kind of the point that Flossie is making, Trump is doing enough awful stuff that is completely verifiable. We should be concentrating there. Thank you, Heather.
And I agree.
David, I see you've got your hand up now. Go ahead.
Well, just a quick thought, and that is that I remember back to this seems to me to be most similar to the Planet Hollywood incident in 2016. And remember, he was Teflon then, and with the religious right, because I think they developed this theory that it was God's will to place the elements of the second coming in a heathen like Trump, and he was sort of the messenger to hearken the advent of this new millennium. But but I don't know exactly where the opposition and the concern is coming from. Which part of the coalition? Is it the religious right of MAGA, or is it some of the influencers? I've seen posts where some of the big popular influencers are against Trump now, including that crazy woman who he invites in all the time for advice. I can't remember her name.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about, Laura.
Yeah, that's the one, right?
Yeah, I'm blanking on the last name.
Laura Loomer.
Say it
Linger,
again?
yeah. Linger, something like that. Somebody said it.
Yeah, Ruth, I think, said it, but
Loomer. Yeah.
one more time, Ruth.
Loomer.
Laura Loomer,
Loomer.
thank you. And right, Joe Rogan has
Right.
turned against Donald Trump and turned against Donald Trump, I think, to Joe Rogan's credit for the brutality with which Trump has pursued the deportation policy. And Tucker Carlson has turned against Trump for bombing Iran, right? And so I want to be as clear as possible. Politicians, particularly presidents, particularly national leaders, need to assemble coalitions. The coalitions are always products of compromise, aggregation, reconciliation, so they always have potential fracture points, right? And one of the things that makes a gifted politician is his capacity to bring to the fore the things that unite the coalition and keep to the margins the things that would fracture the coalition, right? That's part of the art or skill of a good political leader. And so back to your question, is it the Christian right who thinks that a heathen is going to bring about the messianic period, right? Or is it the conspiratorial right who thinks that Donald Trump actually pals around with Jeffrey Epstein because he's doing investigation into the corrupt elite in order to be able to bring them down, right? This is the QAnon stuff. And I want to say the world is not divided into those neat segments, right? There's overlap between them. And I think what matters more is, do the forces of fracture ultimately become stronger than the capacity of Donald Trump to continue to unify his coalition? I think there's some signs that congressional Republicans are beginning to worry that Donald Trump can't hold the coalition together much longer. And that if Donald Trump can't hold the coalition together much longer, boy, are they out on a limb with the big, beautiful bill, right? And, they have to face elections in 2026 and 2028. Donald Trump is no longer a candidate for office, right? And so, yeah, I do not know that there's one segment of the coalition that is jumping ship. I think what's happening is the coalition is just looking a little bit more fractured, a little bit less cohesive, a little harder to hold together. And that in a sense, Epstein is just the catalyst for the potential breakup of the MAGA coalition. And it points out, right, how difficult it is to maintain a coalition when what unifies it is social media generated ideas, because they're untethered, right, to anything other than what the algorithm directs attention to. And that's dictated by artificial intelligence and human attention and its peculiar dynamics. That's really, really hard to control, right?
I suppose our hope is that uh, congressional Republicans will be more intimidated by the threat of a betrayed electorate when they sold their health care and other benefits down the river than they are being primaried out by Trump's millions and billions.
And I'll just add, I think we have to be alert, right, to the fact that what Donald Trump is doing is attacking all of these civil society organizations, the mainstream media, NPR, PBS, the universities, the law firms, and the next play, if Donald Trump's coalition starts to fall apart, is to rely less on the need to assemble a coalition and more on the ability to coerce the population or to use disinformation to confuse the resistance to his politics and his coercion. I think one of the things we should be really alert to is how much more money went into ICE in the big beautiful bill. And the fact that people in the Trump administration are half jokingly already referring to immigration customs enforcement as the secret police, right?
Yep,
That should be
Trump's Gestapo.
and so please note, right, they're marching through MacArthur Park not because there's anybody that they've got a warrant or anybody that they really expect to detain, but as a show of force to say, we're here to occupy the public spaces in this city. And the first target, yeah, it's migrants, it's people with brown skin, it's the people who the right prevailing disinformation mythology says took your jobs or undercut your wages. But I don't think it stops there. And please note, right, that in addition to billions of more dollars to hire ICE officers, there's billions of more dollars for the use of surveillance technology by ICE to come after people. And so I just think that we need to be really alert to the idea that it's not just that the Republicans might turn against Trump because they worry more about the next election than they do about Trump's vindictiveness, but that Trump may be executing a playbook that says, don't worry about the next election because there's not going to be a meaningfully competitive next election. I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm not saying he's powerful enough, right? Our attraction to, our commitment to elections, to speaking our mind, is deeply woven into the political culture of our society. I think it's going to be really hard to eradicate. We're not in Russia. We're not in Hungary. We're not in places where these are new institutions that people are still trying to make up their minds about. This is who we are, right? But having said that, it's not working very well for any of us in the 21st century. We may need to start figuring out not only how to resist a would-be autocrat, but also how to make democracy work better for us if we're going to continue to sustain this experiment. We've gone way over. I'm always happy to discuss this stuff with you guys. You guys always raise such interesting points and ask such good questions. But I think I do have to go. Flossie, I'll give you the last word for the day. Go ahead.
Make good trouble.
Yes. That can be our rallying call. Make good trouble, everyone. Have a good week of good trouble. I will see you next week. Be well. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Take care.